Now I'd like to present our co-organizer, Dr. Constanze Itzel, the museum director from the House of European History in Brussels, and I'd like to give you the floor, Ms. Dr. Constanze Itzel.
Yes, good afternoon, dear colleagues from the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, dear experts and dear listeners. I would like to warmly welcome you to this event on behalf of the House of European History team, and especially to thank you for having chosen our museum as a partner for your important event. It's a great honor and pleasure for us to host you. You are creating a modern Holocaust museum, one of its kind in Eastern Europe, a study center, a research institute, a place for educational activities, and an online multimedia platform. An extremely important place, therefore, for the young generation to understand what human beings are able to do and what needs to be prevented. Most importantly, you are committed to telling a rather forgotten story of the Holocaust, about the horrors of what has been called the Holocaust by bullets. Around 2.5 million Jews, 1.5 million of them Ukrainian Jews, were not taken to the gas camps, but shot dead and buried in mass graves. As our permanent exhibition in the House of European History also shows, National Socialists used mass executions as a regular method of terror before and during the systematic mass murder of European Jews in gas chambers from 1941 onwards. In our permanent exhibition, we display evidence of these atrocities from the different occupied territories and from German allies in Eastern Europe. Bullets from mass execution sites of Jewish victims, a map with numbers of executed Jews, Jews executed by German mobile killing squads, to name but a few. Other civilians were also turned into victims, and they were selected on ethnic, political, or religious grounds, but sometimes also randomly chosen. In our exhibition, we display these atrocities jointly from different countries. And this is for us, this testifies of the huge scale of the National Socialists' inhumane vision for Europe, a vision to reorganize Eastern Europe along racial lines, based on the definition of some groups as subhuman. We end our display of World War II and of the Holocaust with a special memorial space for the victims, and a quote by Elie Wiesel, who said, "If anything can, it is memory that will save humanity." For me, hope without memory is like memory without hope. And I think that both our institutions, yours and mine, ours, not mine, preserve the memory of victims with the hope that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated and that the victims will not be forgotten. As history museums, this is our commitment: to inform, to show evidence, to teach, to be a place for debate. And so I think that as the largest mass grave in Europe, Babyn Yar really deserves more attention, also at international level. And you are committed to bringing the sufferings of 100,000 Jews and of other civilians into collective conscience. Today's event is a very important step in this direction, and therefore we are very, very honored that we can co-organize this together with you. And I wish us all a very fruitful debate and the Holocaust Memorial Center all the success it deserves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Itzel. And now I'd like to present to you Mr. Natan Sharansky, who is currently the chairman of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center of the Supervisory Board. You know him that he was used to be a political prisoner of the Soviet Union. He is a human rights activist. He was minister and vice prime minister in Israeli governments, and he was as well head of the Jewish Agency. Mr. Sharansky, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you, dear friends, for organizing this very special event. Today is the 1st of September, the day when our children and grandchildren go to school, but also the anniversary of the Second World War. And naturally, there begins another round of anniversaries, 80th anniversaries of many tragic events. And here, the 80th anniversary of the killing in Babyn Yar is still a very special event. Not only because it is the biggest massive grave of the Holocaust. Not only because it's probably the most quickly filled, this grave, when in 2 days 34,000 people got direct from their homes, were taken to suburbs, stripped and killed. But it is kind of symbol of those millions killed Holocaust by bullets. I think it's Father Desbois who brought first this term. And we have to understand that if we want now to fill the gaps of history, of all these tragedies, so we know much more about that awful tragedy of Auschwitz and Birkenau, and how and when and who was brought there, and what were the conditions, and what was the fighting, and what were the challenges. There are so many memories about it. But here, 1.5 million people in Ukraine, European citizens, were killed in the matter of hours and minutes. But that is not the only reason why it is so important to restore the history. That's not the only reason why it is so difficult to do it. The thing is that Babyn Yar is also the symbol of the efforts, of the crime of Soviet communist regime to erase the memory of Holocaust. I was born in 1948. All my childhood was between Donetsk and Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov and Kyiv. It's really killing fields of Holocaust. And we knew almost nothing about it. My playground was only 2 miles from the mine in which Sharp 75,000 people were thrown. It was the second biggest mass grave of Holocaust after Babyn Yar, but we knew practically nothing about it. And Babyn Yar, it was like a rumor, like kind of ghetto, ghost. It's nobody can tell exactly what it was because it was not permitted. We were celebrating regularly the great victory in the Second War against Nazi regime. And who were the victims? The victims were Soviet soldiers and partisans and civilians. The word massive killing of Jews didn't exist. And when suddenly finally there was in 1961, the poem of Evtushenko, why there is no monument in Babyn Yar? For a few days we thought now it is permitted to speak. Our parents started telling us quickly what it really means, Babyn Yar. 2 or 3 days, and then a new campaign prohibiting or forcing the poet to change all these words, and again, nobody knows. Nobody knows. So finally, there was a monument in Babyn Yar. There was no mentioning that Jews were killed there. And when I was arrested many times as a human rights activist, some of my arrests were because I tried to go to Babyn Yar and other places to on the ceremonies of those anniversaries of these massive killings. And that is why it is so important that independent Ukraine is ready to restore this history. And that's why I was so honored when I was proposed to become the chairman of this world. We have a very ambitious aim. It's really, as Dr. Constanze Itzel said, we are going to have the major monument, archive, historical center, research center of killing by bullets of so many citizens of Europe. And Ukrainian government is fully supporting us, and President personally is very involved. But it is not so simple. It needs a lot of courage for the government of Ukraine to face this project and support it. So no doubt that support of European politicians and activists is very important, and I want to thank first of all the European Parliament Working Group, Babyn Yar, Memory of the Future, its co-chairman, Michael Gahler and Monica Benova, and of course, Constanze Itzel, our host. It is a very special place, and we're glad that you gave us to speak in this very special place. And of course, the last but not the least, Father Patrick Dubois. It is such an honor for us to have you at the head of our scientific group and to cooperate with you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sharansky. And now I'd like to present to you Mr. Michael Gahler, a member of the European Parliament and co-chair, as Mr. Sharansky just mentioned, of the working group Babyn Yar Memory for the Future. Mr. Gahler, I'd like to give you the floor.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you. And I'm very grateful that we can share this moment and this event here in the House of European History to remember the tragic events in Babyn Yar now 80 years ago. And when I was asked whether I would like to participate, I said not only spontaneously, but out of deep conviction, yes, because it is so important to contribute to the memory of what has happened. And as a German who has dealt with politics and history, and especially this most tragic part of our history, I've always felt it as a moment of relief and liberation to address and to be confronted with this lowest point of German history and European history, and the particularities that go with Babyn Yar has already been referred to. And in the run-up to this event, I read an article from Bert Hoppe, who scientifically as a historian has worked on the events that happened there. And reading this article, it is once again shocking, not only the event as such, that people were killed massively and in such big numbers at the outskirts of a city, not somewhere in a deep forest where nobody could see it, but where the shots could be heard and the people on the way to their killing could be seen by some even. And this reading through that, and what is especially shocking is also this this precision and planning how that was all conducted, which is something that is really moving all those who dare to address this tragic event. And I'm aware that, for instance, one way to do it by Dmitri Shostakovich was already in the 60s to have a symphony number 13 named after Babyn Yar. Sometimes you can express the horror through music if the words are missing. And I think that is one way of dealing with it. But today, it is especially important, I think, in countries that have gained their freedom later than the west of Europe, like in Ukraine, where it is also difficult to assess the history, what has happened in their own country, partly dominated, of course, in the Soviet times from Moscow, and not being able to assess and address local issues in the way it should have happened. And when you read again this article, it was so shocking to see, which is not a relief for the perpetrators, for the criminals who ordered it, but to see so much denunciation and collaboration also, and to address that in your own country, in Ukraine now, it is something painful, but at the same time also relieving, because when you address the truth, when you face the reality, that gives you the strength to work for a better future. And the symbolism that comes with the specificities of Babyn Yar, I think, should be and will be preserved for the future generations to come. And I'm confident that in Ukraine, they have the power and the strength also to see that. I was in Dnipro, where there is in the menorah also a museum of the Holocaust, where there is Babyn Yar, there is a section for Babyn Yar, very realistically depicted. And when I was there, accidentally, there were young conscripts who were there. That was part of their training, that was part of their formation as Ukrainian soldiers. And that made me very glad to see that, yes, while you are defending Ukraine's independence and freedom, you also remember the past. And I think these are symbols and signals that make us optimistic for the future. And I hope that what is going to be seen in Babyn Yar and remembered is a sign of hope that history will not repeat itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Gahler. And now I'd like you to present Mr. Petras Auštrevičius from Lithuania, who is as well member of the European Parliament and in the delegation to Ukraine. Mr. Auštrevičius, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you for this possibility to address you, and thank you all friends and those supporters of this project to commemorate crimes committed a bit more than 80 years ago in Babyn Yar in Ukraine. Well, it's a bit symbolic that we're having this event on the 1st of September, I mean, start of the World War II, once the Nazi Germany attacked Poland and with the involvement of the Soviet Union. 2 weeks later, it became really a catastrophe, which led to deaths and killing of so many, too many people. Well, I have to address this issue in a bit broader context, because the atrocities, crimes against humanity of the 20th century, such as Holocaust, Holodomor, and deportations, imprisonment committed by all totalitarian regimes, doesn't matter what color, Nazis or Soviets, should be never forgotten. And we have to understand those crimes against humanity in much broader sense. In fact, we are concentrating now on Holocaust, on the inhuman crimes committed in Ukraine in 41. And in fact, it was rightly said by many, and it is kind of departure point in this whole project, that forgotten story. Indeed, it was deliberately forgotten story for ideological reasons. But now probably we have to, not just to disclose this forgotten story and to explain it to people, but we have to understand this story. And we have to tell that story to school children, to young generation, to educate them in a way to let people not just forget the crimes. It's impossible, I mean, to forget and forgive those crimes, but to do everything possible not to repeat those crimes. And in fact, to generate an ability of humanity, of understanding and commitment to live for a much better future. And for me, you know, it's so important of full and direct participation of the Ukrainian politicians in organizing, you know, kind of maintaining public narrative, never again. I think it's a great possibility for the new democratic Ukraine to raise up from the ashes of history and you know, to tell absolutely new story for today's citizens of Ukraine, to agree among the people, citizens of Ukraine, to make conclusions which should lead absolutely to the different European future of Ukraine. So I'm really thankful to all those who are behind this project, who run this project on the daily basis. We're looking forward for complete completion of this project. And indeed, it will be a great day once we meet and visit Babyn Yar on that day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Auštrevičius. And now I'd like to present you Mr. Marek Rutka, member of the Sejm and chair of the Parliamentary Group for the commemoration of the Holocaust crime at Babyn Yar for Europe free from genocide and hatred. Mr. Rutka, I'd like to give you the floor.
Firstly, thank you for the invitation of this conference, of this meeting. It's an honor for me to attend this event and say a few words about the parliamentary group, which has been established in the Poland Parliament to commemorate the crimes of the Holocaust in Babyn Yar. It was founded, the group, in Sejm on this December 2020, and now includes 8 members of Polish Parliament. And I am privileged to be the chairman of this group. So now I want to describe very shortly the group priorities and acts. The first is education and distribution of information on the tragic events that took place in Babyn Yar. The second is remembrance of the Holocaust victims in Poland. And third is improving Polish-Israel and, of course, Polish-Jewish relations. Therefore, we must do everything together so that history will never repeat itself, especially now in the times, very strange times of the rising anti-Semitism around the world. Thank you for the invitation of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rutka. And now I'd like to present you our today's keynote speaker, Father Patrick Desbois, who is founder and president of Yahad-In Unum and chair of the Scientific Council of Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Father Desbois, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you, and I would like to send all my congratulations for all the people that I see, that most of you are personal friends, from Ruslan to Sharansky to Marek, and I miss all, and Andre and Martin, and I will begin by Wendy because she published a book. We knew about this book since long time, and I was wondering why Wendy, who is so talented, took so much time to make a book. And when I read the book, I understood, because she investigated during years and years, like an FBI girl, about one shooting from one picture. One shooting of Jews with a very vague picture, and she could find everything about it, even the name of the photographer, and even how he took the picture, who was involved in the killing, and that and that and that. And I think what you did, Wendy, is like for us a huge wake-up call. Either we speak about Holocaust like something that happened, that will never happen again, etc., etc. But if you speak to young generation, and me, I'm a professor in Georgetown, Washington, young generation barely know what happened. I am actually in Guatemala. People don't even know where is Europe. And so there is a full new generation who has no idea about that. And Babyn Yar is, of course, unknown. The only name that they know, perhaps, is Auschwitz and Hitler. Everybody knows Hitler in the planet. So when I've been asked to cooperate with Babyn Yar initiative, I was very proud, but also full of responsibility. Because the first thing, I work, you must know, I have interviewed 8,000 people who were present at the crimes done by the Nazi units from Lithuania to Azerbaijan. And unfortunately, there are mass graves in all these countries. of Jews, gypsies, disabled people, communists, and sometimes simple partisans of or neighbors or civilians. And always my question is, if you remember Babyn Yar or big shootings like that, like in Lviv, or like in Brana Yagora, or like in these big places, how people could stay. These young people coming for Babyn Yar mainly from Germany, from Stuttgart, from Köln, from Berlin, from Munich, from beautiful cities. Most of them were young. How they could do that, to stay 3 days, killing babies, grandma, nice people, old people, whole families, and because it was not a machine, it was not a camp, no barbed wire, no oven, nothing. Every killer saw his victim, and every victim saw his killer. And until now, I don't get the answer. You know, I studied Holocaust by bullets in all these countries, and Hitler never missed workers. There is no country where he went and nobody wants to shoot the Jews, the gypsies, the partisans, etc. He finds people, he has people. And we were working to find back the list of the Germans involved in the killings of Babyn Yar, because I think it's a duty to say, no, it's not Babyn Yar who killed the Jews. Babyn Yar is a place. It's human beings. And it's why I'm so proud of what did Wendy, because we have to give back responsibility to the local guy. Because it was not Hitler who was a machine gun. It was not Himmler who was a machine gun to shoot 30,000 people. Everybody was a killer. And we have not forget that they took responsibility, and most of them have not been judged guilty after war and made their life normal life. They were not serial killers. They didn't shoot people in Germany coming back. It was over, the game was over. And they did that since the beginning of the war until the last day of the war. So my first question is an anthropological question. How is it that young people, young German mainly for Babyn Yar or from other countries, accepted to assassinate face-to-face young people, children, and grandma? It's a question for today. It's a question for today because me, I work in Iraq for the victim of ISIS and the victim of Al-Qaeda. I work with the Yazidi and the Christian, and Baghdadi never missed anybody to make these killings. And he did the same thing. He put them in mass grave, and nobody comes back in the same way. By example, near Raqqa, there is a huge mass grave as big as Babyn Yar. Journalists came, but now it's over, it's finished. Perhaps we'll see that in the next 80 years. So that's the first point. The second point is that I have been working since a long time about Holocaust, and one of my friends was a Polish, very upscale person, Stefan Vulkanowicz, and he was member of the International Committee of Auschwitz, and we were friends. He was even hosting me in his house in Krakow. It was in the Soviet time, I speak, so it's a long time ago. And I will never forget, we were sitting at a table, and he told me, Patrick, Hitler made a mistake. He was a thinker. He has built a snack, and he was a thinker. And I say, which mistake, Stefan? And he told me, he built Auschwitz. He told me, and I say, why do you say that? He says, because Jews are coming back in Auschwitz. But when they killed the Jews in forest and gypsy in forest, nobody came back. And so that's the first thing. And it took me 10 years to understand what Stefan Vulkanowicz was saying. When you put people in a mass grave, it makes no memory. I agree that Soviet erased the memory, but every country has mass grave. Every country, think of your country. I'm sure you will find mass graves somewhere, but nobody wants to remember. Everybody has bad people on the ground. You know, I will give you an example coming from my church. I'm Catholic, as you imagine, I studied a lot. And when we studied the beginning of the story of the church, you study the fight between Roma and the barbarian, etc. If you go to Roma, you will see no mass grave of barbarian. They are underground. So it's to make what you do in Babyn Yar, for me, is like an anthropological miracle. It will be the first time in history on the planet that a huge memorial with different places will be on a mass grave, because Babyn Yar is first a huge Jews mass grave. And on other mass graves of Holocaust by bullets, there is nearly nothing, same way like near Lviv or near north of Odessa or in Belarus, the same. It's in the middle of nowhere, there's a small monument, even it's 40,000 people. So what you are doing in Babyn Yar, what we are doing in Babyn Yar, it's, I would say, an anthropological miracle, because it means that 80 years after, we are coming back. We are coming back to remember all these Germans who came to assassinate a full population in full broad daylight in a big city without any remorse, because I'm sure no German family sent a letter to ask for remorse about that. These people died in their bed. And it's also a call to humanity, because today in Syria, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in all this part of the planet, in Iraq, and I hope not in Afghanistan, a lot of mass graves with different population, Christian, non-Muslim, Muslims, etc. And it's a call for humanity to say, to call to the killers to say, be careful, sooner or late, we are back. Sooner or late, we come back. And I think it's such an honor that in Ukraine, mostly the Babyn Yar Center, the Jewish community, has the courage to come back. I will add something else. You know, I could interview people from all the countries of post-Soviet Union or connected to the East, so from Lithuania to Azerbaijan. All that has been video recorded. As you said, some people have been victims also of the communists. That's an evidence. And I would say people, simple people, accepted to speak. This job has never been done in France. This job has never been done in Italy. This job has never been done in Belgium. You will never see the local people speaking. What was so strong for me when I came to Ukraine, because my grandpa was deported in Ukraine, and I began by my story of my grandpa. He was not Jew and he was not communist. And I realized that simple people accept to speak. Very simple. We don't judge people. We are not here to judge them. We are here to know what happened. So I think Babyn Yar 80th anniversary must be a wake-up call out of Ukraine. If it stays an Ukrainian story, it's a catastrophe, because the Germans who came, they were not Ukrainian, and Hitler was not Ukrainian, and Himmler was not Ukrainian, and Heydrich was not Ukrainian. And so we have to send a message outside. I am actually in Guatemala. There are also a lot of mass graves. In North Costa Rica, a lot of mass graves, etc. We have to heal the planet, because today, from Europe, young people are leaving Europe. We know we cooperate with the police of Belgium, with the federal police of Germany, of France. For who? For people, young people who left their country, went to Syria, went to Iraq, and put in slavery Yazidi and participate to a genocide. Recently, the Parliament of Belgium recognized this genocide. So we cannot say never again, because we should say never again today, in Syria, in Iraq, in Nigeria, with Boko Haram, because how many Christians also are killed today? And so I think what you are doing is a huge lesson for us. And I'm so proud to cooperate with you. It's a strong honor. Also for me personally, as my grandpa was deported during 2 years in Ukraine, it's a fidelity to my roots. But you are right. It's a wake-up call against any regime, fascist, communist, Islamist. At the end, it's the same disease. These people suddenly wake up and say, oh, my destiny is to join this unit, will assassinate thousands and thousands of people. And they do it. And when the war is over, they come back in their bed. We have also to speak about the Germans who participated in that, because it's also a call for justice. Of course, they are dead, of course. But if we forget the killers, It's also a signal that we will forget also the people who left Western Europe or Kazakhstan or any country, even Australia, to join ISIS and to make killings during 3 years. So I wish you, all of you, a very important time. We are not here only to commemorate the past. We have to do what Wendy did for one place with such an energy, but she can explain you how much time and energy she had to engage to do that for each crime, because it's the same disease today. And open your TV. Tomorrow you will hear a bombing somewhere, a shooting somewhere. We have to take responsibility like perhaps we never did. And Europe, unfortunately, had so many people who left Europe to participate to these crimes. You know, when I see the cursors of these people, some people were educated. I know doctors from France who joined ISIS. I know people who were nearly engineers who left Germany to join ISIS. It was not only poorly guys, same disease. They joined Hitler, they joined Baghdadi, they joined Stalin, they joined Pol Pot, same disease. Thank you so much. And God bless this initiative, because to do that in Europe, it's a place where it happened. And unfortunately, we know also that many other people, not German, participated to this genocide. It's not to condemn them, because it's not a national disease. It's a human disease to participate to a genocide. And unfortunately, we didn't find the vaccination against this tendency to be member of a genocide team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Desbois. So now I'd like to invite you to move to our panel. And I'd like you to present our today's two panelists. First, Professor Dr. Wendy Lauer, who is the John K. Roth Professor of History and Director of the Grubbin Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College in California. You know her perhaps as the author of the National Book Award and National Jewish Book Award finalist Hitler's Furist, and as just Father Desbois said to us, she published this year the book The Ravine, about her research on a photograph of a mass shooting in Ukraine. And our second panelist is renowned Dr. Martin Dean, who is currently an adjunct professor at Kean University, and as well as historical consultant to the Simon Wiesenthal Center and to the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, where he served as well on the scientific committee. And among his publications, I would like to highlight his work as the volume editor of the United States Holocaust Memorial Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos in the volume 2. And I'd like perhaps first to start with Wendy Lauer, and I'd like to give you the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Patrick. Everyone, it's great to see you, Martin. And I'm so honored to be part of this gathering today. Greetings from California. The sun is rising. The fires are not raging here in Southern California. Thankfully, I can breathe. And the bears have walked off my property, and now the horses are coming out. I'm kind of isolated here. It's my sanctuary. It helps me regroup and refresh. So I just wanted to send greetings. I'd like to share my screen for one moment for my presentation. If you just bear with me, we all know how this works, or it's supposed to work. And let me put up my program, my little presentation here. And let's see. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, I'm seeing shaking heads, great. So if you'll just bear with me for the next few minutes, I wanted to stress a couple of points today, which Father Desbois has already mentioned. One would be the European aspects of this history, of what we can glean from Ukrainian history as European history, to stress the European dimensions of this story. because I think one of the problems as far as looking at Holocaust studies more generally is a tendency to over-regionalize and overstate the national kind of boundaries of this history. And when there's already a tendency, a bias, a kind of Eurocentric bias, it's very Western, to even diminish or even to think about the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet regions as somewhere else. And we know about, even with Ukraine specifically, how many years it took us to remind people that the Ukraine with the article the is a kind of regional designation that had been used first by the Russians and then by the Germans, but in fact, it's much more than that. A lot of my students are shocked when I tell them a statistic that Dieter Pohl mentioned in a writing that I also included in the ravine, and that is that 1 out of every 4 victims of the Holocaust resided in what is the boundaries, the borders of Ukraine today. So thinking about Ukraine as part of a bigger European story, not only the Holocaust, but of Jewish life, obviously just the Pale of Settlement as a concentration of Jewish population in Europe, and in fact, the overlay of that, which is Nazi-occupied Ukraine. And so just, I mean, just logically, where you have the greater numbers of Jewish populations, historically, that civilization of Jewish life in the Russian Pale, and then, you know, the Nazis targeting that very area because, as Hitler said in the summer of 1941, he did not want, he told Kvaternik, his Croatian ally, and I'm going to talk about the importance of international alliances here as well in the European story, but he told Kvaternik in the summer of 41 in July, as this Holocaust was beginning, the killing phase, he did not want one Jewish family to remain on the continent of Europe. He said they, over the centuries, with the expulsions, they come back, and he was going to pursue this final solution in the most final way. And he's doing this in this context of the Operation Barbarossa invasion, with an eye towards the occupation of and dominance of the actual area known as the Pale of Settlement, where these populations were residing. We think about all the iconic images of the Holocaust and what comes to mind, you know, as Father Desbois said, we've got generations now where it's not about memory receding, it's just about complete lack of historical knowledge or references. I'm working on a book project right now about Heinrich Himmler, and I employed 2 students this summer, one a rising freshman and another one a senior. And I said, you know, that they were talking to their friends about their summer project, their internship, and most of their friends didn't know who Heinrich Himmler was. The name didn't mean anything to them. So we're also starting with a challenge of just general historical education and not only memorialization, but making sure that we are introducing students to this very history and responsibly going into the details of it and the complexity. But when students are asked to kind of tell me, when I ask them, you know, what do you think of when you think of the Holocaust, and some of these iconic images come to mind, of course, they don't really know, they might identify Anne Frank, but they don't know the people or the places in these photos, or they'll mention Auschwitz-Birkenau and that iconic image, the entrance to the gates. And excuse me, by the way, for putting up these images without any kind of warning, as it were, these graphic images. But actually, Ukraine is part of this iconography of recall of the Holocaust in a more of a visual way. And most, you know, people don't realize that several of these pictures were taken in Ukraine, and that this one, the last so-called last Jew in Vinnytsia, which is a caption on the back of that photo, is really one of the more popular ones, if I can say so, in the museum world. It's also part of some pretty crass commercialism among anti-Semites and deniers who have turned this particular image into kind of t-shirts and coffee mugs and so forth. But when we think about the Holocaust and the features of the Holocaust in Europe, we find them in Ukraine, and we just, you know, don't quite appreciate to what extent the Holocaust was the European story of the Holocaust. The Holocaust, we know it, is basically what we know happened in Ukraine, the massive loss of life proportionally, also the other victims who were targeted, the Roma, the disabled, the POWs, the fact that these different methods that the Nazis tested out and the different ways of carrying out the collective violence, whether it was pogrom type massacres, mass shootings, mobile gas vans, deportations to killing centers, the importance of international collaboration and local collaboration, the fact that we have Slovakian, Croatian, Italian, Spanish expeditionary forces, that they're Hungarian forces, Romanian forces, that they're all part of this at this higher level of involvement in a formal military campaign that then also is wrapped up in behind the lines what's going on with the massacres of civilians and the sorting out of POWs. The local police forces, the kind of work that Martin Dean has done that pioneered really this work on local police forces and local helpers. The history of rescue and the role of the churches and monasteries, the history of ghettos, both as kind of holding pens and staging areas and places of destruction, the use of forced labor, the construction of the Autobahn, the fact that this is part of a larger Nazi imperial project that engulfed all of Europe, and then the history of aftermath, of justice and memorials and education. All of this is kind of what we have teased out in a way in our studies of Holocaust history as kind of features of it, aspects of it. And I think we need to kind of apply this all, and in the case of Ukraine, and as well learn from what happened in Ukraine and bring that back into the larger European story. Also, our explanations for the Holocaust as far as regional variations and various factors and anti-Semitism and nationalism, integral nationalism, and again, the imperial project that the Nazis engaged in, the colonial genocide, as it were, that is a model that they imposed, which we can apply to a lot of other cases historically, even predating the 20th century. In the book that I just published that Father Desbois mentioned, here's just an illustration of that importance of international collaboration. The photographer, the Slovakian photographer here is sitting in the middle. This is taken in Miropol in September 1941, so shortly before he started taking some of the atrocity photos that were featured in my book. But again, to remind our students and audiences that it's not strictly a German kind of local dynamic, occupier and local dynamic, but that you have international forces. And again, this is so then a European story to fight Bolshevism, to fight communism. This individual in the center, the Slovakian security forces, he was not a collaborator as such. So we have to, kind of drill down and look at every individual case before we start placing labels on individuals. But this image is to illustrate the presence of these other non-German forces in this imperial project. And of course, this very famous image that you're all familiar with from Babyn Yar, the extent to which the Germans pursued the mass shooting there as the extreme case of the mass shooting, and what that does to the use of the ravine, the environmental history, the landscape, what's there, the materiality of this. These soldiers are searching through these objects that were left behind, the plundering campaign that Martin Dean has, and the use of property and the kind of recycling of that in the local population, things that Martin Dean and also Father Desbois have also worked on, and our colleague Andrei Umansky. I'm sorry for this disturbing photo. It's the reality of the Holocaust. Is a feature of the book, The Ravine, but also I think is another starting point for looking at all the features of the Holocaust. Again, this is in Ukraine, but it is a European story. The fact that Jewish families are targeted, and that Hitler said no Jewish family, emphasizing the genealogical root and branch approach to this, of the women and children, the procreative force that they're trying to extinguish in order to eradicate an entire population. It's happening in broad daylight. You have collaboration at this intimate level, shoulder to shoulder. Germans and Ukrainians, they don't speak the same language, and yet they know what to do here, and they're carrying it out. And again, the family at the center, the use of the landscape, the fact that this is still with us in a kind of geological sense. When we go to these places, as Father Desbois said, we have mass graves that are punctuating, that are they're perforating all these small towns across Europe, it says it right, across the world. I'm was just driving to Yosemite 2 weeks ago and discovering the mass grave sites of the Native Americans who were wiped out during the gold rush. So this is a history that we all tend to suppress. It's underground, and it's incumbent upon us to start literally doing some digging. The post-war story of justice, which is, again, a Ukrainian story as much as it is a European one, and the variations on that. And a lot of scholarship has been done on that recently, comparing different countries and their kind of records of justice, and maybe who was more successful than others as far as prosecutions and so forth. All very important studies, often with a emphasis on the political kind of Cold War influences. But Ukraine is often not part of this story of justice. And in the case of the photo that you just saw, justice was actually achieved. These are the one of the two Ukrainians in the photo who was actually arrested in the mid-'80s and prosecuted and convicted, actually killed by a firing squad in 1986, 87. So the pursuit of justice really coming up into almost the present day. If you think about the scheme of things, this was yesterday. And how do we uncover lost civilizations? In this case, the Jewish life, what they call kind of life before. And this is where memory and history kind of come together. Omar Bartov has just finished his study, another angle on his work on Buchach, looking at the storytelling over the centuries. And in fact, this kind of oral history is really important for recovering those lost civilizations, because when they're lost to genocide, they're that much more difficult to uncover, because let's say the will to uncover it for those who are left, if there's anybody left, is not so great. It's a shameful past. The victims have fled in a kind of diaspora. They're not there. They don't return, as Father Desbois said. So it's the community of like who's left. It's their role, and that's a big challenge. And that's what's kind of leads me to this idea of how do we actively memorialize? And memorialize can be a kind of somber moment of grief and mourning, and really in the immediate aftermath of the war. First, the search for the missing was obviously an active endeavor, because people wanted to be reunited with their families. But once the realization struck that there were no survivors, of course, that's just a human reaction to grieve and to become more emotionally kind of withdrawn. It's this moment of it's devastating. But now, while that memory of that and the direct familial connections to those victims has changed because of the passing of survivors, we move into a kind of active mode of memorialization, of the construction of institutions, of the gathering of evidence, of the collection of testimony, of the teaching of the subject matter, of the rituals, annual rituals of non-survivors coming together, of everyone around the table today, Jewish, non-Jewish, who are kind of collaborating in the best sense of the word to try to keep the history alive. And the institutions that we have to do this, that we need to support and also continue to work in and bring our students to, like Yad Vashem and the museum in Washington. In fact, as I'm speaking right now, or I think it's almost simultaneous, President Zelensky of Ukraine is touring the museum in Washington, D.C. And today's Wednesday. I think he's either going to see Biden before or after that. I don't know his itinerary. That's important, that kind of international diplomacy and going to these sites and putting it on your itinerary and showing the world that this history matters and that it's important. Here we have a testimony that was taken in 2000 by a survivor who's accounting for her lost relatives in the town of Mirapol, and remarkably had this photograph that was attached to it. Very few photographs attached to these kinds of testimonies. These were women and children who were killed in that massacre, that photograph that I showed you of that family being killed. This was what was left of them in 1941, no men, just the women and children. This is how they wanted to be remembered. And they knew that these killings were happening in their town, mass shootings had already occurred, and they were fearing for their lives and grieving their lost loved ones. And here, in terms of this active memorialization in all its forms, as Father Desbois has also really pioneered this, going into these sites, talking to the local population, encouraging them to share whatever they can. Here's a Ukrainian woman who, as a child, knew the Jewish families in the town. Her mother had worked as an worked in the paper factory that was owned by or run mostly by Jews, historically established by the Jewish community. And she's holding up that very picture I just showed you of that Jewish family and trying to do that hard memory work and identify who those people are in the photo, and even telling us more names of Jewish victims. This interview was conducted in 2016. I did this with Andrei Umansky. Actually, you can't see he's sitting next to the woman. Actually, you might be able to see his shoulder. He may have got cut out of the photo, but he probably will recall this interview. But it's that kind of work on the ground with the local population, and also going into these sites and kind of excavating history and finding these locations. The locations tell us a lot about what happened, the proximity of the crime, as it were, to other houses, to forts, to monasteries, and to that very local history, and helping people write that history and understand that history together. It's really difficult work, and Andre and Patrick can speak to it, because it's the work that a lot of people just don't want to do. They want to keep things underground and they want to suppress the history. This kind of active memorialization and searching, continued searching. Here are women in the Szeged synagogue. I mean, going through shoes we think of so much as these iconic images of the Holocaust that are along the Danube or behind glass, enshrined in glass in various institutions. But here we see that kind of active search for the missing that we, I believe, have to continue as we pursue this scholarship, and we talk about education and we talk about memorialization. One of the victims that I studied, and a diary that he wrote, he didn't survive. He was shot in Przemyślanie in 1943 as he tried to resist his own fate, and pulled out a gun and tried to shoot a German and missed. He didn't have any opportunity to have any target shooting, but he did have the opportunity to obtain a gun, but was unsuccessful in his attempt to kill that German. And he and his colleagues, other laborers, were immediately killed. But one of the last entries in his diary, I think, speaks to what was mentioned in the keynote, and what I'm also trying to stress. And I'll just quote from Samet Goldfard's diary entry of April 11th, 1943. Every village and town, every forest brims with graves, looming from a distance, as a historical lesson and a warning. Once the living witnesses are gone, then those graves will speak volumes. They will accuse the whole world with an eloquence 100-fold mightier of having committed or having failed to act against the cruelest of crimes. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I would welcome any of your questions. And I so appreciate everybody's commitment to this work, and that you're here today, and that you're supporting the establishment of this new memorial in Kyiv that will help us understand the history of Ukraine, but also the history of Europe more broadly in this very tragic chapter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So for those who came later, as we told beforehand, you can ask the questions below in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button on your Zoom, but I would suggest that we take all the questions for later and go on with our second panelist, Dr. Martin Dean, and then we'll turn to your questions afterwards. So Martin, I'd like to give you the floor for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Andre. I also have a PowerPoint which I will pull up. And thank you especially to Patrick and to Wendy for their excellent introduction and overview. Patrick gave us the global perspective. Wendy gives us more the European and just a really excellent look at the different approaches to the Holocaust in Ukraine and in Europe. And I want to go now really to the specific, what happened at Babyn Yar, how does it relate to the Holocaust by bullets? I especially appreciate the remarks by Patrick about the detailed research necessary, almost forensic work that's done by detectives. I worked for 10 years as a war crimes investigator, actually in Australia, which Patrick also mentioned, and also for the United Kingdom. And we basically did most of our work in Ukraine and Belarus, including some forensic work in Ukraine. And this is really the important thing, is to be able to prove 50 years later, we were doing research 50 years after the events, and to make it real to a court of law, to a jury in Australia or in England who had really no knowledge of these events. So you have to be very detailed and careful, but you also have to show the evidence. You have to allow the evidence to speak for itself. And this is really what I've been doing in connection with the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center and the site at Babyn Yar, is to just explain some of the things that remained unexplained. The Holocaust by bullets is the murder of the Jews in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, and parts of eastern Poland by mass shooting between 1941 and 1943. It was conducted mainly by the German security police and order police, with the support of the Waffen-SS, the Wehrmacht, and local collaborators. A detailed example of the Holocaust by bullets was the shooting of some 33,000 Jews at Babyn Yar in late September 1941. This largest single mass shooting took place soon after the security police, on Himmler's orders, expanded the target of operations to include Jewish women and children. So today, first we'll look at the operations of the Einsatzgruppen and examine the full dimensions of the Holocaust by bullets in terms of numbers, time, and space. Then we'll look at Babyn Yar. Using photographs, testimonies, and aerial images, I'll reconstruct the route taken by the Jews into the ravine and identify the location of the mass shootings. By following the discarded property and clothing of the Jews, captured in photographs, this leads us like a trail of breadcrumbs to the site where the massacre took place. The Einsatzgruppen were the SS and police squads that followed the army into the Soviet Union to deal with declared enemies. The Einsatzgruppen kept detailed records of their mass shootings that added up to more than 1 million victims in total. Einsatzgruppen report number 106 states that 33,771 Jews were shot at Babyn Yar on September the 29th and 30th, 1941. By August 1941, mass shootings were an almost daily occurrence for the Einsatzgruppen. The method used in June and July for smaller mass shootings resembled the procedures of a firing squad, as you see here. Initially, the Einsatzgruppen targeted the Jewish intelligentsia, but increasingly also Jewish men aged between 18 and 45. From mid-August, one Einsatzgruppe after another expanded the killings to include women and children. By September 1941, complete Jewish communities were to be exterminated in newly occupied towns and cities. The German security police used deception to facilitate their murderous plans. The mass shooting at Kamianets-Podilsky, commanded by higher SS and police leader for southern Russia, Eberhard Jeckeln, was the largest killing of this type before Babyn Yar. The Jews arrived at the shooting site in a long procession. There they were led into ditches, possibly bomb craters, and were shot by SS men. On August 30th, Jeckeln reported the final total killed in Kamianets-Podilsky as 23,600. Germans, assisted by collaborators, killed some 2 million Jews in Belarus and Ukraine in 2 waves. First, the Einsatzgruppen and order police swept through the region in 1941, but in most places only part of the Jewish population was killed. More than 440 ghettos were established in 1941 to 42 in German-occupied Belarus and Ukraine. The remaining Jews were shot in a second wave by German police and local collaborators in 1942 to 1943, as all ghettos and labor camps were cleared of Jews. The Jews were killed in mass shootings within earshot of their own homes, such that local neighbors often observed these events. Yahad-In Unum, over the past 15 or more years, has documented hundreds of these sites by interviewing local inhabitants who witnessed the Jews being marched away to be shot. In Kyiv, on September 24th, 1941, several large explosions wrecked buildings used by the German military administration along the main street, the Kreshchatyk. They were caused by mines set off by the Soviet Security Service, killing dozens of people. The resulting fires burned for a week. On September 25th to 27th, SS and Wehrmacht commanders jointly decided to murder the city's Jews as a reprisal for the explosions, or at least this was the pretext they gave. Placards calling on all Jews to present themselves at a road junction near Babyn Yar were posted in Kyiv by local collaborators on September 28th. The threatened punishment for non-compliance with this order was death. How did Jews react? Some feared the worst, but most expected that there would be some form of resettlement. Jewish teenager Vera Bogutska noted, "Most people were of the opinion that we would be sent away to work. My mother packed up our things. I saw that the streets were full of people carrying luggage. Some of them had carts. They were all going in one direction. Towards evening, my mother and I left our apartment with our luggage. We went down several streets with many other people. The collection point was near the Jewish burial grounds. In response to the placards, more than 20,000 Jews took to the streets of Kyiv on September 29th. Here we see a 3D model reconstruction of the first checkpoint created by Max Rokmaniko and his spatial tech team. The checkpoint was the place where non-Jews accompanying friends and relatives had to turn back, vehicles could go no further, and the Jews had to continue on foot with only what they could carry. Leonid Pushta, who was a driver for Sonderkommando 4A, drivers were a large component of the Einsatzgruppen actually because of their mobile abilities. He wrote, or commented after the war, "I drove out of Kyiv and came to an alley. There was a checkpoint which led me through. I saw that along this alley, Jews were marching. They were going in groups as if for a stroll. On the left lay an enormous pile of luggage, about 3 meters by 2 meters. It looked like a huge pile of potatoes. The Jews threw their luggage onto this pile. At the end of the alley on the right, there was an open area where the registration took place." So the Jews marched down Melnikov Street, which you can see here, passed through the first checkpoint, which is actually probably back here somewhere, and then turned left here onto Kahatna Street. From there, they turned right down Dogorozhitska Street, which is actually the alley you can see in the photographs. And they came to the end of the main Babyn Yar ravine around here. This is probably where they were registered and had their documents taken away. Most historians agree on the route to this point, but where did they go once they entered the territory of Babyn Yar? The main clues we have after this are a series of photographs taken shortly after the massacre by the German propaganda photographer Johannes Hehler. The Hehler photographs show piles of clothing in what looks like a sand quarry, and also Soviet POWs covering over the ground in a long, narrow ravine. But where were these photographs taken? To identify the shooting ravine with the POWs, we used the lone tree on the skyline as a reference point. This was visible in photographs of the main ravine taken after the war, but could not be seen, initially at least, on the Hehler photograph. So here you see obviously the lone tree in 2 of the 3 photographs, but where's the lone tree here? Here we see the tree clearly visible on the skyline in 1946. But although the same crescent-shaped cliff is visible in the distance, we cannot see the tree on the Hehler image. So we decided to blow up the Hehler photograph, as in the 1960s movie. If you enlarge the cliff top, you can see the lone tree on the edge of the cliff, but it is concealed from a distance by the stand of trees behind it. Literally, you can't see the lone tree for the woods. Using aerial photography, we're able to confirm the contrasting lines of sight and pinpoint where Gahler was standing on the road at the end of the western spur. And we've also able to identify the sand quarry, which lies between the two branches of Babyn Yar. This is important as it's missing from most maps of the area drawn either before the 1930s or after the 1950s, as it simply didn't exist in those two times. It was created in the late 1930s and plays such a key role in the events at Babyn Yar, both in 1941 and also in 1943. Most of the Jews were forced to undress in the sand quarry. This is confirmed both by witness statements and by the Gahler photograph. This slide shows the position of the discarded clothing as seen from above, sort of projected from the Gahler photographs. It indicates that the bulk of the Jews walked around to the left towards the western spur. This is here, the western spur. This is where Gahler was standing for his photographs, looking down this long ravine here. And so the Jews most likely entered the western spur through this notch that was created probably during the war, more or less for this purpose. Albin Pover, a German policeman, testified, the Jews had to undress at the end of the sand quarry, when partly naked, partly in their underclothes over a steep slope, and disappeared into the adjacent valley or behind a mountain slope. From there, one could hear shooting. This map shows the likely location of the mass shootings inside the western spur. Several separate shooting squads were operating along the length of this branch of the ravine. And here's the view of the Gahler image down the western spur, which also matches the description by the German driver Victor Trill, who was standing at roughly the same spot. He says, looking from the bridge or the road, the depression made a turn to the right, where behind this curve, a large round depression in the ground was located. And this is actually the sand quarry you see hidden here behind this telegraph pole. And so it all matches up. There's the lone tree in the distance. It is possible that this sand quarry was a former sand pit or gravel pit. In this pit, there were also countless people who I can safely assume were Jews. Also in this pit were mountains of clothing of all sorts. Most Jews entered the ravine via the notch in the middle of the western spur. This was also likely the spot from which Dina Pranicheva and other Jews fell into the ravine from above. Finally, just to cover the Soviet aspect of this, that really the details of Babyn Yar were covered up in many different ways. There was the restructuring of the landscape, the denial of a monument, of course, was the most important part, but also the denial of the Jewish victims of their own identity. And Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote his famous poem, Babyn Yar, after his trip to Kyiv in August 1961. The opening line, "No monument stands over Babyn Yar," was an indictment of Soviet suppression of information about the Holocaust. The poem became a rallying cry for Jews and other writers who gathered at Babyn Yar for commemorations in the following years. The Soviet memorial was eventually completed in 1976. We referred to the victims only as peaceful Soviet citizens, continuing the Soviet policy of concealing the Holocaust. So thank you very much, and that was useful for everyone.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, and then we would close the panel with a presentation by Ruslan Kavatsiuk, who is the Deputy CEO for Science and Education of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Ruslan, I'd like to give you the floor.
Hello, hello everyone. I will also share my presentation. I would like to tell you a little bit more about the territory, how it looked, how it looks now, and how we work with it. I will try to be as brief as possible. So some slides I will not comment in more details, as I planned, as a lot of things were covered by previous panelists, and I will briefly show you, but if you focus on the territory and the way it looks, and the evidence that we know about the victims, the things that Martin just described. If you see the territory, please remember it from this photograph. And I will try to stop here briefly, just to say that after the war, during USSR times, it was actually concealed, and this was a place where the waste from nearby brick factories was filling it, and later on the dams broke, and the major mudslide killed hundreds of people, which basically eliminated all of the traces, and the symbolic place of fighting for the truth about Babyn Yar was actually inflamed by the poem that Martin just referred to, and then the monument Martin mentioned in 1961 about the Soviet citizens. No Jews mentioned. After the ravine was erased, basically it looks now as a park, and different monuments that commemorate different groups of victims, since not only Jews, but also Roma and prisoners of war and patients of a psychiatric hospital and different political enemies of the regime, communists, nationalists, partisan, were killed here. However, mostly more than 2/3 were Jews. Now this place looks like this. Former cemeteries that were here, Jewish cemetery, Karaite cemetery, Muslim cemetery, Orthodox cemetery, they were all erased. This area is no more sandy area as it used to look like. It's a place with dark land and trees all around, with simply woods that grew here in 60-80 years, and in some areas it's quite wild. This is one of the spurs that left untouched, and it's a complete oblivion picnic area where people usually, fry meat and have their weekend time. No memory about what happened here as an urban park, but nothing reminding you about what happened here. So as an institution, we were established a little bit less than 5 years ago. We are a privately funded NGO supported by the government and the president of Ukraine, who actually now, it's true, he visits at the moment Washington Holocaust Museum. It's an interesting coincidence. Our supervisory board is led by Natan Sharansky and has lots of prominent human rights activists and philanthropists and politicians. And we also have academic council chaired by Father Desbois, and public council, architecture advisory board, and team of more than 60 people led by Max Yakover as CEO and Ilya Khrzhanovsky as artistic director. So as we look at this place, it was one basically 2.5 kilometers long, huge ravine, 50 meters deep. It was at the edge of the city in 1941, 80 years ago. Today, it's almost between the edge and the city center, closer to the city center. It is basically almost completely over time. It was completely erased. As you can see, over time, it was transformed into park area. And as we look at all the aspects of this territory, we're looking at 130 hectares of the territory of Babyn Yar as a commemoration place. The vision we have for it, we look at it as a place that is a story of different people who died here and survived and rescued. And this polyphony represents life in all its complexity. But this story is very has many different details. And when we look at it, we understand that the way we want to build this memorial is, on the one hand, we want to look at the territory, the landscape, and on the other, look at all the stories of the people that were part of this. And together it will be a memorial based on these two pillars. We understand that this place, this nature and soil, why I wanted to show you a lot about this territory, is also a living archive of this tragedy. And since we have, we don't have, you know, there a camp or walls or anything that reminds you about it. Even the bodies of victims were mostly destroyed by Nazis as they retreated and burnt down. But we look at a number of indoor and outdoor locations on those 130 hectares, and we want to tell that story of through this place where it actually happened. Of course, it changed a lot. So you see how over time the greenery takes over this place, and basically it transforms this area, and we want to use this to create an architecture museum ensemble that will basically be a place for different journeys for the different visitors, a personal experience that can be built through many visits, where different locations, different museums can be part of it. Of course, we understand it will take time to build all of this. So we have this idea of non-stop creation of the memorial. What is already done? I will show you a couple of the things that have already appeared in last year and have already changed the perception of this territory. This is a mirror field installation. It is installation with names of victims that are pronounced there with different voices of women and men and children. Of the actual 28,000 names that we have verified, and we know that these were actually the victims, and this number is growing. And these 10 columns are shot through with bullets, and it's an artistic object, but also it's a commemoration object of the victims and their names, where people come and they see their own reflection, and they hear the names of victims, and they hear the songs, the burial songs, different rites, Jewish, Christian. We also have put monoculars actually on the actual place where the photographer in 1941 was standing. We identified that spot together with the research that Martin was doing with Max Rohmanika's team, rebuilding 3D model of the ravine and then placing it on the current map and locating the GPS coordinates of the photographer where he was standing. It was a difficult work to do, but now we know when people look into those monoculars, they see the pictures and they know that this was the place where the photographer was standing. And they see how it looked 80 years ago and what was happening here. As you can see, the place is completely different. Nothing reminds about what happened here. So we started with this small step to bring back the memory to this place. And we created a series of those binoculars. Some of them are in the city, so that this tells the full story of the Babyn Yar in Kyiv. We also created some monuments that tell the story about the Kurenivska tragedy. That is also part of the Babyn Yar context, with the documentary videos that you can see that were hidden in Soviet archives, were never public, but were made for the leadership of the Soviet Union so that they understand the scale of the tragedy. And now we've made it basically on the place of where the dam broke. We brought it back to the place, this memory about this tragic events. The other building that we already created is a synagogue that is made as a pop-up book. It actually opens and closes, but it's painted with the same paintings of the destroyed wooden synagogues of the Western Ukraine that were destroyed during Second World War. And it also brings back the memory of the destroyed world and the life that is no longer there. It is located behind the Menorah monument and right next to the part of the ravine, the only part of the ravine that stays there. This is how it looks as it's closed. What we want to also do this year, we will finalize the first memorial museum space, where we will have a 3D model recreated in a big scale under a hill that usually in Ukraine is called kurgan. It's a traditional form in steps of burial sites. And inside will be this is how it will look from the outside. And inside it will be the 3D model of the ravine and all the scenes that happened 80 years ago in this place. So that people can see it from a distance and then through the binoculars see it closer and understand the story that happened there. We also want to create an artistic installation by artist Marina Abramovich, which will look like a crystal wall of crying. It's a coal. Coal will be the material for that, and there will be crystals incorporated into this wall as part of artistic approach of Marina to the commemoration. And we also understand that this will be this will have symbolic place, as the wall will be located on the same axis of the Western Wall from Jerusalem, because it goes through Kyiv, through Babyn Yar. We understand that different people will come to Babyn Yar for different aspects. Some people will come to see the artistic object of Marina Abramovich. Some people will come to pray. Some people will come to see the 3D model and reflect on what happened. And then people will see more and more objects and buildings and museum spaces that will talk about different victims of Babyn Yar, will tell the story of Holocaust by bullets, and will tell the story of Kureniwska tragedy and the oblivion during Soviet times. And altogether, this will tell the complex story of Babyn Yar, and will give us an opportunity to commemorate victims and try to learn from this lesson. As Father Patrick said, for us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruslan. So I'd like to invite you, ask your questions now for all of our three panelists. You can always write them in the Q&A. And in the meantime, perhaps I would allow myself to ask questions to the colleagues. So I would first have a question to Wendy, because it struck me when you talked about your students working for you and talking to their friends about Heinrich Himmler. That wasn't a name anymore for them. I have sometimes the same issues with students of mine, that they don't know people, important people from Nazi regime as well. In your opinion, what does it change for the classroom? How we should teach now, or what's the challenge now for us, those who teach in classrooms and universities or schools? In your opinion, what do you think? What will be our tools in the future?
Oh, I think first of all, it's important to ask our students, to be aware of what they don't know, because we kind of come into that situation with a lot of assumptions. And I had this challenge as well when I was teaching Holocaust history in Munich between 2007 and 2012. There I was in the birthplace of the movement, as they call it, or what have you, Hauptstadt der Bewegung. And this was mostly international students had come through the Erasmus program. So they were from Poland and Finland and even from the States. And I just found myself making references to things like Einsatzgruppen, Heydrich, and their eyes would kind of glaze over. So this has been going on for a while. And we don't want to lose them in that way, especially as scientists, to stop and really get a sense from the room, from your audience, what the level of knowledge is from, like, say, the beginning of the semester, to see where your starting point is. And, make sure that foundational knowledge is conveyed to them from the beginning. And depending on the course, if you have time, you can dig deeper and fill out those biographies in more detail. But if you just have, one session or two sessions, if you're a secondary education system, you have to think very hard about what is it that you're trying to get across. What is important ultimately. You may not get the details of Himmler's biography and his fate at the end of the regime, but what are the bigger questions? Like in the case of Himmler, that he was, in the history of terror and the history of genocide, stands as this figure, really in many ways standalone figure as far as his executive power and what he was able to accomplish, and what his thinking was and where he came from. Some parts about his biography that one could relate to today. For instance, in his letters to his wife, he talks about, or in his own writings that have been uncovered, how much his father influenced his thinking. And in his diary writings as a young person, as a 15-year-old, how he's fuming against the Jews and the Jewish conspiracy. It's like someone at that age, wouldn't come upon that information independently. I mean, you can imagine him around the kitchen table, just imbibing, kind of indoctrinated, and the angry father, kind of inculcating him in this way. So, being specific about the things that you draw out of his story and that chapter, that may be resonate with young people today. They say, okay, I get it. So it's just being a little bit more thoughtful as a scholar and a teacher, and obviously always knowing your audience.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So I'm looking for questions. Please don't be shy. You're all welcome to put questions. I have one here. Yes, from Ruslan. Do you already have a program for individual and group visitors? I think that means right now.
Yes, we do. We do have a program for individual and group visitors. We also are preparing, or have prepared already, a program for the 80th anniversary of the massacre, since it will happen in September this year, but the official commemoration events will happen in 5 and 6th of October due to Jewish holidays, and that would prevent for many international visitors to come. So Ukrainian government agreed to move the official ceremony a week later, and so that will happen in a month, and we will have a number of both international and physical events and online through September and October. But we definitely understand that there will be many groups and there will be many teams that will work to have tours in different languages.
Okay, thank you, Ruslan. And one more for Ruslan is, I will shorten it a bit. How will be implemented in the museography the fact that besides the Jewish victims in Babyn Yar were killed as well other people like disabled people, Roma and Sinti? How will be implemented?
Yes, I tried to address that partially in what I was trying to say, but we definitely understand that there will be Holocaust museum for Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe. We consider Babyn Yar as a symbolic site that is going to tell us the bigger story. And also we understand that there are other groups of victims, and we want to have a separate museum space dedicated to that only. To the Babyn Yar tragedy also we plan to have a dedicated space for the mudslide, Koreniivka mudslide tragedy that killed hundreds of citizens in Kyiv. There will be a separate story that basically is linked to Babyn Yar, but it's a little bit different. And also we want to tell the story of the oblivion of the tragedy, how it was completely erased. And there is a huge story there. And Natan Sharansky was referring to his own personal experience, how it was. So we want to create that museum that actually is, there is already architectural solution approved by the government and the president, and we're looking forward to build it next year.
Thank you. And I think that Mr. Gahler has a question that he will address himself.
Yes, thank you very much. I had noted some time ago, or during this whole discussion process, there had been some inner Ukrainian quarrels of who does what and who is responsible and how is that all set up, and that had some issues whether there is too much influence from Russia or not. I found that all, and I'm not blaming anybody in any direction, but I found that very unfortunate, so to say, that this important memorial and the memory and this activities seemed to be a bit overshadowed by these quarrels, or how should I put that? Now, has that been in a way settled or been regulated in a way that doesn't, so to say, in a way disturb the real purpose of that all? And has the government or whoever taken a position to not calm it down, but to unite or to reconcile these different tendencies that had been around, who does what and all that? So could somebody explain where we stand in this regard?
Most usually it's Natan Sharansky who's responding that question, but since he's no longer with us, I will try to respond to that. So I think a month and a half ago, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, presented this forum dedicated to 30 years of Ukraine's independence. One of his priorities to build a memorial in Babyn Yar, and all of our team was there presenting this project. And the president said that he wants to finalize all the discussions with this presentation. So there was this kind of communication from the president and the government, with the prime minister involved, and the minister of culture and minister of education and so on. But there are different groups of people, and I don't think that everyone agrees to doing it one way. So there are many people who disagree with different ideas, with different historians' judgment and books, and there is all the time the difficult discussion about different aspects and placing different types of conspiracy theories and responsibilities and so on. It does not help that we have this Russian aggression and Russian troops on Ukrainian soil. It in this whole project with commemoration. So some politicians use that as a tool to oppose the president. As the moment the president supports this, you get different politicians opposing it. So it's rather disappointing that some politicians use this as a tool. But that's the reality that we see, and we have had over this year almost 90% of Jewish communities uniting behind the memorial and saying that they would not want it to be politically used. We had, the different leaders of churches also saying that they want politicians out of this discussion. So it's a difficult discussion inside of the country, inside of the civil society. But what is important is that the place as it was last year, if we met there, you would see no big memorial. You would see a park with some monuments. You wouldn't usually even know what these memorials or monuments were. We actually measured it through sociology, and most of people who live nearby, more than 50% are not people who grew up there, and they don't know that this is not the usual park. So even people who live next door to this place, they didn't know that this is just something unusual. Not everybody reads the transcription under the memorial. You have different monuments there, and not everybody knows that. In fact, more than half of the Ukrainian population does not know in what city Babyn Yar is. So the oblivion, the Soviet Union actually succeeded in erasing this completely, erasing the memory that 1.5 million Jews were killed on Ukrainian soil. Nobody knows that. So this is something that we want to actually oppose, and we want, and we do that with the installations, with the buildings, the museum buildings that we do there. We try to attract attention to this place. We want to attract it find a language to speak about it, because we understand that this is not something that is there, even the ravine is destroyed. So it is an effort to find a new language to talk about this kind of tragedy, and we know that it's a very difficult task, and we understand it's a risk. It would be most probably much easier if we just copy pasted Washington or Yad Vashem Holocaust museums, but we understand that the story of Holocaust by bullets is different. That is why it's all very, very complex. But I think it's very important that we as a society, we as a country, go through this discussions and all of the, we want to translate as every possible book about this, every possible article that was ever printed into Ukrainian, also, so that people know and people understand and people learn about it. So it's a long-term mission, and I don't think it will end in a complete consensus in a year from now. I think it will take time. It's my personal understanding.
Thank you very much, Ruslan. Before we go out to the other questions, I'd like to ask as well something to fellow researcher Martin Dean, because who worked and who showed us in his research work how he worked on topography of the site, and me myself, who started we work since a lot of time on topography of the Holocaust and genocide. And I'd like to ask Martin, because you would be surprised, such place as Babyn Yar, you should know since long time where exactly are the place of the crime, the roads, the mass graves, but there are very few books, works about it from researchers like Nachmanovich and others, and your recent work now. In your opinion, why was it so difficult to establish the topography of Babyn Yar? I mean, I recall you killing of more than 33,000 people. And what was your challenge when you worked on the photographies, testimonies? Was it the language, the different languages with different sources? Perhaps you could explain us a bit more about your proceedings.
Thank you for the question, Andrew. I didn't have really enough time to explain the complexity of it today. Essentially, this was Karel Berkhoff's idea, that he had thought that if you use aerial photography together with ground photography, you could somehow really reconstruct many elements of the story. But the really important part, and that was also always Karel's idea, was to compare this then with the witness testimonies. And what's really been most helpful actually is the witness testimonies, and even things like even the old maps. They may not be completely accurate, but they have little details that show you something. So I realized, for example, that at one stage they were extracting sand from the northern part of the ravine, and then in the 1930s they changed the method. Instead of using railway trucks, which are a little bit cumbersome because you can't move them very much once they're in place, they started using auto trucks, combustion engine ones, which are more mobile, and that's when they constructed the sand quarry in the 1930s. And so although the sand quarry is so clearly important from the photographs, it took me at least 3 months to work out where exactly they were, because I was thinking, well, it must be the end of the ravine because of the height of the cliffs. It looked like the cliffs were far too high to be somehow in the middle there. But then when I looked at the photograph closely and compared the size of the cliff with the height of the man standing on the top, I could calculate roughly the exact height of the cliff and see that it did in fact match up with the sand quarry, which I thought was only, it's what, about 20 meters high, but it looks much higher in the photographs. That's part of the problem. So sometimes the photographs themselves can give you an optical illusion, and many of the parts of the story had been traced by historians like Nachmanovich, but the real issue was, well, where did the shooting actually take place, and what was the role of the sand quarry? And if people didn't know that the sand quarry existed, then how can they understand its role? So this was really important to be able to track this kind of pre and post history of the sand quarry. And then of course the clothes themselves, then they disappear soon after the shooting, most of them, but they're in place on the day after and even during as the shooting is unfolding. And this is like the trail of breadcrumbs that you follow to see where the Jews were standing, and then you understand the methodology. And there were speculations before by historians, but the danger was that they didn't really match up with the evidence, especially of the witnesses. So we know a lot more now, but there is still quite a few unsolved riddles with Babyn Yar. Plenty of work for historians to do.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I would return now to Ruslan again. I will bundle several questions in one. First question would be, how will the museum will deal with the theme of anti-Semitism at the site? And the other question would be related to what Father Desbois said about the perpetrators. How will we address this difficult matter when commemorating the victims has to be in foreground?
Yes, both valid. So regarding the anti-Semitism, we actually, at the moment, as we expand the area of the actual installations and monoculars and buildings that we create there, we of course have personnel that works there, and we have this proper security and so on. So there was no case like anti-Semitism. There was one case of drug dealing where people actually put inside of one of the installations drugs, but they did not understand that there was a proper security and video cameras. But we understand that it's only because we have the proper security, and we also understand what is changing is that people started perceiving this place differently. So a lot of people now see that it's not just a park. They have huge installations and huge buildings there that tell the story. And they have audio installations where for 300 meters you walk and you hear different voices of different people speaking out the names of victims. All of a sudden you understand that you know, this Sarah, 6 years old, Yaakov, and so on. So you all of a sudden understand that you're not just walking in the regular alley of a park. All of a sudden it's different. So there is a change of behavior of people who live there and walk there every day. We see that, and it's more respectful. I think it's a great change. People do not, you know, drink alcohol there anymore in the brunches. It's different, and I think it's what we're trying to do there is actually change the perception of the place as well. So the local authorities, you know, make now extra effort and so on. So it's altogether very good result, and I think we're moving in the right direction. From the perspective of perpetrators, that's clear. We have now the project that we're trying to identify by name every person that participated in the crime by name and the roles. So you would have there 2,500 men killing those 34,000 Jews in 2 days. Right? We want to understand who those names were, who these people were, what were the roles, how the decision was made, what was the reporting line, what were the roles, you know, and so on. And then we also try to learn the stories before and after of the shooters, of course. So it is our job to identify it, not in general, but going into every possible detail. And that is the work that our academic team is doing right now, and Andrei Umansky and Martin are part of this work. And of course, we work to also identify names of victims, and we have now found many new names never known before, but also we put together all the identified names in previous years. So we cross-referenced them, we found the mistakes and so on. So we've done this work where we almost now have 29,000 people. And we also know many more much more information about many people. We have documents. We understand their nationalities. We understand whether they were, killed as families or not, and so on. So it's all now getting together as a one picture, and it's huge work done by lots of researchers. And but we understand that this is very long road to go, because we have not only Babyn Yar, but also many other places in Ukraine, thousands of shooting places that we will need to find a way to commemorate as well. But Babyn Yar is the center of it. We must make things right there.
Thank you so much, Ruslan. And on this note, I'd like to close the event. Thank you to all the people who connected. And I'd like to thank first the members of the European Parliament Working Group, Babyn Yar Memory for the Future, the chairs Monica Benova and Michael Gahler, co-chair Petras Auštrevičius, Vladimir Cimošević, Rafael Glucksmann, Hannes Heide, Niklas Herbst, Lukasz Kohut, Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar, Elżbieta Lukaczewska, Ludmila Novak, Fluvio Martuscello, Frederic Rees, and Viola from Cramon. Then I'd like to thank as well our speakers, Dr. Constanze Itzel, Natan Sharansky, Michael Gahler, Petras Auštrevičius, Marek Rutka, Father Desbois, Dr. Wendy Lauer, Dr. Martin Dean, Ruslan Kavatsiuk, and Marek Siviec. And then thanks goes as well to our technical staff who made this event possible, from the House of European History, Christian Uhl, Eva Goodman, Johanna Urbanek, William Parker Jenkins, and Liam Forbes, and for Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, Anna Lashichina and Laura da Silva.